All right, everybody, welcome back. Just a quick announcement. We have Threat Hunting CTF right now starting in Lockpicking Village. And right now we're going to listen to Marcus Richerson speaking on Tales from the Lockpicking Village. Let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, thanks for having me today. So my talk is going to be Tales of the Lockpicking Village, and essentially it's going to go over a variety of physical security techniques and also some stories from lockpicking and other things. Basically who I am, I work for a company called Somerset Recon. I do pen testing as a day job, and I also like going to a lot of conferences like these and volunteering to host lockpicking villages, as well as volunteering to do CTFs, and kind of combining a mixture of the two. So today we're going to talk about lockpicking villages, non-destructive entry, destructive entry, semi-destructive entry, some MacGyver techniques, defenses, and conclusions. So you might have seen a lockpicking village. There's one here at LayerOne. They often kind of have tables with a lot of locks set out. And this is a picture from Defcon. It's a common theme to set up a bunch of tables, throw out some locks, and just kind of let the people go at it. Here's one from B-Sides. Here's one from Toorcon. Now, Toorcon is actually the first place that I learned how to pick locks, and when I went there, I just went to the security conference. This was, I think, about maybe 14 years ago, something along those lines. And the person who was running it was Datagram, one of the guys who helps run this conference, and he taught me how to pick locks, and ever since then I've been practicing. But it was a good intro for me into computer security, learning how to defeat physical security mechanisms, and it got me to help or to participate a little bit more in some of the events at these conferences. One thing I really like about LayerOne is it has a lot of hands-on activities, and you can kind of go around to the different villages and mix it up and learn a lot of things with some hands-on practice. So some of the events that I've helped host, I've done over approximately 40 events over 8 years, and the people who I've been teaching have been anywhere from 5 years old all the way up to 91 years old. And the smallest event that I did was about 15 participants, and the largest event that I did had about 900 participants, meaning actually 900. In this particular case, it was a STEAM event, science, technology, education, arts, and mathematics, and kids ranged from elementary to high school, and they kind of just ran in, and were just throwing handcuffs on and said, "Let's do this." So it was quite a challenge, but one of the things that I think is nice about lockpicking is any age, kind of any ability can come and they can solve challenges and have fun. The median local event participation that I usually do is about 35 people for about 3 hours. I feel like that's kind of a good window of time. For the conference events that I've done, it's been about 115 participants median, as well as about 16 hours, and it usually runs for 2 days, similar to a conference like this. Now, when I first started, I utilized a very similar strategy in my lockpicking village, was to have locks on the table. I had about 12 on my first go, and just kind of let people go after it. Now, one of the challenges with that is some people would come, they say, "I don't have picks. I've never done this before," kind of thing. So I tend to adapt my strategy, and how I've adapted the strategy is to teach someone by holding a lock similar to this picture right here, and step by step kind of instruct them. And the other thing that I learned was if you do a stepladder approach, by utilizing, going for the very basic stuff like the handcuffs or some of the bypass techniques, and then going all the way up to a clear lock, maybe some quick sets after that, deviant master locks, and then going up into the higher security locks. For example, the Master 140 has a spool pin, which is a good one to practice on. The 150 has 2 spool pins, and then going up from there to like a Master 570, which has about 4 spool pins, and then maybe an ABIS or something a little bit more advanced, as well as teaching different techniques and more advanced techniques. That's what I found works pretty well. This is a picture right here of a contest, a CTF, that also involved physical security challenges. Here's an example of a scoreboard. You can tell that there's a lot of different challenges. They range from crypto, reverse engineering, digital forensics, and then on the left-hand side, there's the physical security category. If you guys have participated in the CTF here, I'm helping host it along with Tom, some of the guys from Qualcomm, George, another Tom, and we have a physical security category, so feel free to come check it out if you have time. So this is a scoreboard picture right here from one of the Toorcon CTF that we helped out with, and the Lockpicking Village is number one. They helped host the Lockpicking Village at Toorcon, and they did very well, as they should. Neg9, this is a funny story, they are a really well-known CTF team, and their first time ever doing or maybe not first time ever doing physical security challenges, but probably not quite as experienced as the Lockpicking Village, and they ended up trying to social engineer their way into flags by asking me to give them the flag, and the technique that I was utilizing at the time was to, as soon as you solved the challenge, I had a piece of paper I would rip out, give you the flag, you'd put it on the scoreboard, and they were unsuccessful, but I commend their efforts. So here's our kind of Lockpicking Village that we're helping do. As you can see, there's a variety of challenges, easy going from a TSA to a safe lock to kind of a master decoding technique there. Now, I mentioned that I like to do a step-ladder approach when I'm teaching these, and the handcuffs are a good way to intro. Now, when I've done the last, maybe 10, I don't think there's been a single person not to solve the more basic versions of the handcuffs. So I have, about a 99% success rate, which is, fun for people who are doing it. And I start with a clear one. Then after that, I go to the easier handcuff, just kind of left to right here. And it gets a little bit harder. The keyway is a little bit smaller, a little bit more technical, all the way up to the far right one. Now, there's another, let me actually, video here. So you can see that for this video, they are utilizing the picking technique. You can pick handcuffs, and you can also shim them. Picking has a nice trade-off to it in the sense that you can pick the dual locking mechanism that it has, and you can also pick it regular. You get pretty low damage to the tooling, as well as people don't get stuck. So I've had experience where people have shimmed it, where you take a shim and you put it into the handcuff and slide the teeth out. And I've had people actually get kind of stuck and kind of maybe almost freak out a little bit. So I tend to only teach that to a select handful of people, and I go with the picking technique first. When you do the handcuffs, if they're behind their back, you can put it underneath your legs as well, and then pick from the front. This can be a lot easier technique if you are that flexible. And you can see she's basically just trying to take the little lever mechanism inside the handcuff and push it down. Now for shimming is a second technique that I like to teach people, and this works by inserting a piece of metal in between the area of the latch and the locking mechanism, and a lot of padlocks are susceptible to this. One thing that I like to teach and show is that you should start with the smaller side first, put the shim in on the side, rotate it to the center, and then after that, do the other one. So. Warded locks. Now for warded locks, you can identify them by looking in the keyway, and it looks like a zigzag, kind of like a lightning bolt. These locks are pretty good for bad weather conditions. You might see them on a shed or something like that, but they're really easy to bypass, and all you really need is some warded lock picks. And let's see here. Whoops. Go back to this one. So you can see they're inserting the worded lockpicks. You want to insert it all the way to the end. And then after you insert it all the way to the end, then you kind of turn it back and forth. And once you feel that little lever kind of give a little bit, then you give it a little bit more tension, and it opens the lever locks. The worded locks. Another technique is restraint escape, and we've done this a couple times. It might hurt your hands utilizing this technique, but it can be kind of fun. You can use this technique where you break them, or you can utilize the picking technique as well. So you can tell I'm putting my hands together, and I'm utilizing the leverage of my hands and my arms here to break the zip ties. If it's behind your back, you can also try to find a sharp edge to saw it on. The duct tape also is restraint escape, works in a similar fashion, except I tried this out at a conference that I was helping run for the Lockpicking Village, and people got a lot of hair removed, and I stopped teaching that technique. But if you do want to know how to do it, I can show you how to do it. So a very common lock you'll see in a lockpicking village and out in the world, it's probably the most popular lock, is a pin tumbler lock. And the way that these locks work is they have 2 pins in each of the pin stacks. And when you raise the pins up to the right height, it allows the plug or the cord to turn and open. Now, to defeat this, you can utilize a variety of techniques, and one is called single pin picking, where you put a tension wrench in and you press the pins up one by one, and they eventually reach to the correct height. And this is you're able to do this because the mechanical deficiencies of a lock are not quite aligned, so one pin ends up pushing up against the core and resting, and you can kind of go all the way back and forth. Now, this is the technique that I will teach first, usually. It gives people a good theory and understanding of the locks, as well as it doesn't damage the locks too much. Zipping is another technique where you kind of put the tool all the way to the back and you run it back quickly. Raking, where you're going back and forth and rocking. Let me see if I can show you a video here that I have. Okay, so this is a defiant lock, a relatively easy one to pick. You can see the tension wrench. There is a good angle is a little bit less than 90 degrees. And there's a variety of different ways to tension. I'm utilizing this kind of approach with multiple fingers. You can use a finger at the very top of it as well, which is a good technique. That last one was single pin pick. This was a zip where I pulled it back really quickly. Now I'm utilizing a rake tool. I particularly like this tool. It's made by the company Tool, nonprofit, that has amazing rakes called the wave rakes. This is a L rake or a city rake, and this technique is called rocking, where I'm kind of rocking the pick up and down. And one of the things here is you can see that it's not opening. You may have varied success in these different techniques depending on the lock. But if you noticed, I did it for a while, and then I wasn't successful, so I let off the tension wrench, and then I kind of put it back. And a lot of times, beginners, what they'll end up doing, or people who are new to this, is they will consistently keep picking a lock, and the pins will be too high. Thus, you'll never be able to open the lock. And what I usually like to tell them is, if you haven't got a pretty basic lock like that in about 30 seconds, maybe a minute, then let off the tension wrench and then continue again. The other thing I see a lot is turning in the incorrect direction. On padlocks, you're almost always going to be turning clockwise, and some of them will turn both directions. And then on a door lock, pin tumbler, how to tell which way to turn is you often can look at the deadbolts, and it's often turning away from the edge of the door. So one thing to know about locks, too, is sometimes you can turn them both directions, but one may not retract the bolt. And what you can do is you can use what's called a plug spinner to basically pick it one direction, and if it doesn't open, you can plug spin it back the opposite direction. So the other thing people will do is they see it in the movies. Often in the movies you don't have a tension wrench, so they'll just put one pick in, and it doesn't really work that way. Tension wrench not at the correct angle. I talked about a little bit less than 90 is a good way. You'll often see people where the tension wrench is completely vertical, and what ends up happening is you bind up the core, it puts a lot of drag on it, and you won't be able to open the lock. Non-optimal pick or tension. Very often people will have too much tension rather than kind of a lighter grip. And the other thing, too, about the grip is I often tell people to try to hold it like a pencil. And if you're more advanced, what you can do is you can stick your index finger out and kind of touch the lock and use that as a guide. So if you're picking higher security kind of pins, that could be helpful. Zipping or raking, if you feel it get stuck in the lock, usually that means you're applying too much tension. If you zip back and it gets stuck. Pins overlifted, I mentioned that. Bumping too much tension, I'll see this often when I'm teaching the bumping technique, is they'll hit it, and right as soon as it's about to hit their finger, they tense up, and just utilizing a little bit less tension. And also when you bump, you want to hit it kind of straight. Now for bumping, funny story is you can, so for, I think, let's see here, if I have the bumping video, I don't have it, but for bumping, I was at a lockpicking village, and there's these little kind of donuts that you can get from the hardware store, little pieces of rubber, and for those, I was utilizing so you can rapid fire. You can keep hitting the bump tool over and over rather than hitting it, pulling it out a little bit, hitting it again. And a friend of mine gave me some new ones of these, and I said, where'd you get those? And he said, off Amazon. And I said, well, what are they? And he said, they're animal castration things. So they ended up working really well. He told me that his Amazon kind of feed is a little bit different than what it used to be. So, but they work pretty well. Another thing you can do is use a pick gun. This is an automated pick gun. And similar to kind of rocking, it's going to rock the pins up. And there's also a manual pick gun as well. It's a little bit cheaper. I tend to like this one a little bit better. Other types of locks is there is a wafer lock. You can tell by looking at the lock if there's a flat kind of pin at the front, then that's a wafer lock. They're often on lower security kind of installations, maybe a cabinet or a drawer or something like that. And they're often not too hard to pick. There also are wafer lock picks. You'll see them in your kits if you have a circle one or a double circle, which is called the snowman, that's used for raking. And there's also double-sided wafer locks, so you have wafers on the bottom and top. If you look at a car, you might see this on a car. There also are other techniques to bypass the lock rather than just picking. You can kind of go around the security mechanism to basically bypass. The right side here is a master 140, and you can insert the tool here if you put the key change off to the left and the third pin or the third wheel on the top, insert it, push down on the shackle, lift up, and then it'll just open these things. You'll see this lock everywhere, and it's really easy to bypass, and it's kind of funny just going around town and just seeing the Master 175s everywhere. The tool on the left here is an ABIS bypass, where it goes into the lock and just basically goes through the keyway and then turns the little actuating mechanism that allows you to unlock the lock as well. American has a good bypass as well, and those are typically higher security locks, so having a bypass is not great for the owner. There's also tubular locks. So for this one, you'll often see on kind of gaming systems, if you go to the arcade or perhaps vending machines. And you'll see there's kind of pins in a circular motion. And to defeat this, you can use a tool. This one's made by Southward. And you basically put it in and you rotate left and right to impression the lock, and it kind of puts your tool into the correct height, and you eventually do it. One of the things I like to tell people is the trick to this tool is tightening the tool up correctly. So having the correct amount of tightening, you want to tighten until it stops, and then give it a little bit more, and then also making sure that you don't forcibly put too much pressure into the lock, and jiggling back and forth is a good technique to do this. One cool thing about this technique is after you've picked it, you also have the heights of the key. So you can utilize the tool again to open it, or you can utilize the little key decoder on the top there to figure out the pin heights and create your own key. Decoding. Let's see what else we got here. So this technique is called, before I get to decoding, this technique is called overlifting. And you're basically lifting the pins all the way out, both the key pin and the driver pin all the way out of the cylinder, and then you can turn the lock. There it goes. So the real key to utilizing this tool is to make sure that it's correctly oriented in the lock directly under the pins. A lot of people will put it too far back, too far forward, and that can help in utilizing this tool. So decoding is a technique where if you have kind of a combination lock, you can feel for the gauges on the combination and essentially rotate until you feel, and then when you line them all up, it either opens or you at most rotate all of the wheels 10 times and then it'll open. There also are disc locks. You'll kind of notice a disc lock by the circular shape here. And the left side here is a disc lockpick. And how this works is you insert it and you tension it similar to tensioning a pin tumbler, and then utilize the handle to turn each of the discs in the lock to the right height. And you'll hear often similar to pin picking, clicking sounds. And when you get when you pick a successful pin, whether it's a pin tumbler or a disc lock, often you get a little turn on the core. So how do you know when you've picked a pin tumbler? Locks or pin successfully? Well, you'll often hear a little click. You can feel a little turn on the core. You can often know by if you push up on a pin for a pin tumbler, if it's really loose, like a loose tooth, it's probably already picked. And if it's tight, it's usually the next one to pick. So on these disc locks, if you identify the next one to pick, it'll typically be a lot harder to push. So a technique to identifying the next disc or the next pin can be apply a lot. This is kind of a more advanced technique, but you apply a lot of tension, and then when you go to hit that next pin or disc, it'll be a lot harder to push over, push sideways or up if it's a pin tumbler. Dimple locks. Now these are pretty similar to a pin tumbler, except they look sideways, similar to a pin tumbler, but when you put the key in, it pushes the pins up to the correct height. And to defeat these, you just use dimple lock picks. And you can use a left flag or right flag, and essentially just a little kind of hook you can see on the picks here. And what I like to do is I like to put the tool all the way to the side of the dimple lock, and then use the flag to kind of push the pins down. And then similar to pin tumblers, you'll want to utilize the tension wrench, not too much, not too little, but just enough. Manipulation is another technique for defeating locks. On the left, you have a master lock. You'll often see these in schools. It's vulnerable to a manipulation technique. It used to be vulnerable to shimming, and they created anti-shim technology, and now it's harder to shim. And the right side here is what you might see on a safe. So this is a Chinese knockoff of I think it's a Sargent and Greenleaf that is a cutaway here. And manipulation for the master lock is a little bit different. You pull up on the shackle and you kind of feel when it stops in certain dialing combinations, and then from there you can go to a website that's, I think, Sammy Kamkar runs, and he'll tell you that a couple combinations to dial. For the safe lock, the idea here is you'll see the nose is kind of sitting right here, and the distance between here and here is called the contact points. And in the back here you have the wheel pack, and then the gates here, and the fence is sitting in an area you can't quite see, but when you dial this open properly, the nose will sit in here, and the fence will sit in the gates, and you'll be able to open it by giving it usually a right turn. You dial left, right, right, and the right pulls the bolt often. And to defeat these, the first thing to do is to figure out how many wheels are in the wheel pack, The way I like to do this is to spin them all a couple times and then spin them back the opposite direction and listen for the clicks. And once you listen to the clicks, you know how many wheels. It could be 3 or 4. And after that, you want to identify the contact points, which is the distance from here to here. And what I like to do is just wiggle it, turn it, wiggle it back and forth, turn it, wiggle it back and forth. And eventually you'll hear like little clicking, or you will feel kind of the nose hit the edge of the contact points. And then once you've measured the distance for the contact points, you want to get all the way down to like the 4th or the 8th of the number that you're seeing. Then what you're going to do is dial all the wheels in the back to different numbers, and then go measure the contact points in again. And that's the key to defeating it, by measuring those distances. So another type of attack is to attack the latch. And you might have seen this, or you might have done this, is to utilize a credit card where you kind of stick it in forward, or you utilize a slide where you go around the latch and you pull it back. So here is a slide attack, and I like to jiggle the handle a little bit, and then so that was my nephew. He's 2. He's pretty excited I was able to open it. But one trick to that is, as soon as you've kind of got the latch, you want to keep the slide there, because if you pull it back and you haven't opened the door, then it won't be able to open. And then the other technique is to not pull too hard on the door. When you're kind of doing it, you might put a lot of tension between the latch and the door. This is decoding. I mentioned this before, but here's kind of how to do it. You can tell he's feeling around for the little gauges, and once he feels it, the tool sinks in just a little bit more. I can feel the edges, and I'll line them all up. The tool he's using is called a decoder. You can buy all of these tools online. They're relatively inexpensive. So the lock he's attacking is usually used for kind of people selling houses. And since he was able to get the key out, now he is dialing 7 more to figure out the combination for the top part of the lock, the shackle. There you go. There's another type of attack that's called the under-door attack. Now, for the under-door attack, you have to have an under-door tool, and you reach under the door, and then you pull it back up so it hits the door. And then from here, you're going to want to swing it sideways so it rests on top of the handle. And then you pull a little cord, and that pulls the handle down. It's very common that even higher security installations will have a little gap under the door, and per a lot of fire code, the handles have to be at a certain height, and also you have to have a handle as well, so you often see this as a common vulnerability. The impressioning attack or key duplication attack, if you get someone's key or you take a picture of a key and you know the bitting, you can create another key. And for impressioning, the way that this works is these are my files here, and they are number 4, I think, and you'll want to take the blank and put it in and push it really, really hard to the right, jiggle it up and down, and I'll put a little mark there. You can use a little magnifying glass and perhaps a light to identify the little dot that gets put on the key. And you can do it both ways as well, to the left, to the right, and then you file it down, and once you filed it down to the correct height, it won't create any more marks, and then you can create a key utilizing this technique. Often takes a while, especially if you haven't practiced it a lot, but it can be a really valuable attack in the sense that you have a key now to enter. And you don't necessarily need a lot of time with the lock. You can go and jiggle a key, a couple seconds, and then walk away, go back, jiggle it a little bit more. So in intervals, you can attack the lock with a minimal amount of time touching the lock. For cars, you can use a Slim Jim. People are often familiar with this tool, but it goes usually between the window and the door, and you kind of pull up a little lever that attaches to the locking mechanism, and it opens the lock. The reach tools, you can go in from the top of the window or between the door. You can even go from an open window to across the car and push the unlock button on the other side. To do this, often you'll want to use an air wedge, a little pump that kind of can build you a little bit of space in between these gaps, or a wedge, just a little piece of plastic that you can kind of like slam in there to get yourself a little bit more room. Also a vertical lock grabber where you can go through a window or a section, and then the little locks that have the lever on the top that you can grab onto and pull up are often vulnerable to this. So we had a couple lockpicking trainings where we were doing this. This is a technique where the window's open. When I'm teaching this technique, I like to start with the window pretty wide and then go further down and further, or make the window smaller and smaller. You can see I'm using the air pump here to blow up a section between the door, and then I'm going to use a reach tool to go in and hit the side of the door here with a little unlock button. It's loud. Little windy. So for this kind of lockpicking village, what we did was we had a car that the ignition, we pulled the pins out of the ignition, and you can just use it to attack with a screwdriver. Often what criminals will do is after they utilize a technique such as a Slim Jim or a reach tool, they'll get in and they'll pull out the ignition system. And once you've pulled the ignition, you can usually use a screwdriver or a pair of pliers to turn the ignition. It's a pretty common attack. Also what people will do is they'll hotwire the car. They'll pull out the bottom part of the steering column, and then they'll touch two wires together, and they usually have another wire that they touch that starts the car. The defense that was put onto this in vehicles was a locking wheel lock, or sorry, the steering wheel lock. And there is a way to defeat this as well, is to use a hammer to go in and basically pry it, that mechanism out, or to attack the lock. You can pick these as well. Like I said, they're usually double-sided wafers or other more difficult locks to pick. And if you pick it, you might be able to start it, but on newer cars, they have a immobilizer, just a small chip that's in your key that talks to the car as well. So depends on the model, make, and the security of that. So. There also are destructive entry techniques. We were talking about non-destructive entry, and that's usually what we do at the lockpicking villages. It would cost quite a bit if we were breaking every lock that we were testing. And for these, there's a variety of techniques that usually criminals use, and sometimes people just trying to get into their house. You can kick a door in, break the glass, drill the lock. Usually you're aiming to drill all the pins at the top of the pin stack out, and then you can turn the plug. And for getting into safes, you'll see safe technicians often drill a hole through the safe and use a small camera to look at the wheels in the wheel pack. Where that clear cutaway of the wheel pack, if you can see that, then you can line up the wheels and know the combination. Often a saw can be used to saw a deadbolt, and a pry tool if you're trying to basically pry open a door, or a pry tool if you have a little lock and you can go in between the shackle and basically extend it and pop the shackle off. A grinder is a hard tool for a lot of locks to prevent against, but it creates a lot of sparks and it can start potential fires and is a really loud attack. But that's a good tool to use if you really need to get into something. Punch attack, you can often punch the core out, or not often, but you could potentially punch the core out or punch out the lock body of a safe lock as well. Crowbar attack, explosives, bullets, glass cutters, bolt cutters. For bolt cutters, you'll often see different lengths, and the longer the length of a bolt cutter, usually the more leverage you can put on a lock. And there's a trade-off here for criminals in the sense that if you have a smaller bolt cutter, it can be easier to hide or stash. And if you have a larger one, it's easier to kind of break the shackle on a lock. The semi-destructive entry, a door jack, where you can basically take the door frame and, like a jack similar to you'd see in your car, and jack it apart and create a space where you can just push the door in. This may do some damage to the door, but you can also you also may not notice as well. A rip technique and drill technique of a core, and then you replace the core. You might have a new pin height, but someone may not notice for a little while. Another thing is to drill a safe and then patch the hole afterwards. An ice pick, where you have a latch and you can stick an ice pick into it and push it over. It creates a little, damage to the latch, but it'll sometimes you're able to open it. The knife and bolt attack. If you lock your front door and you don't turn it quite enough on the deadbolt, what someone can do is they can go in with a knife and make a little mark on it and then push the deadbolt over, and you kind of do this a couple times to push the deadbolt back in. A hammer. For hammers, you can hit a padlock sometimes and it'll just pop the shackle, and you might have created a little bit of mark, but sometimes it just opens and you can still actually use the lock. MacGyver techniques, paperclip you can utilize to get out of handcuffs as well as defeat pin tumblers. Shoelace you can use to get out of handcuffs and also defeat some car locks, where you basically take the shoelace and put it through the window, and it can grab the little top of the mechanism to pull it up. Soda can for shimming. I showed the shims earlier for shimming locks, and those are steel. Soda can is a little bit more brittle of materials, so utilizing this technique, you might only get a couple goes. It also could be kind of messy. We've done this at a couple events, and sometimes you get soda everywhere, and people can also cut themselves on the soda can. But you can utilize this in a pinch, as well as decoding, the technique we showed earlier. Plastic trash, you see a piece of trash, and you can latch slip as well. So what are some defenses that you can utilize, whether you have a business or you're just trying to protect your house? Always lock the windows and doors. It seems like a gimme, but sometimes if you don't, then someone can get in. Roll up the car windows. By doing a lot of these testings, a lot of people who are just starting to attack the cars, having the window just cracked makes it vastly easier to get into the vehicle. Don't use a quick set or master. I often like to say quick set equals quick pick, and these are the two most common manufacturers, but they're often the weakest with the most amount of kind of attacks and the easiest to get into. Properly fit your latch, and to do this, there's a little pin, and when it depresses, then you can't latch slip. So if you properly fit the latch in the doorway, then you won't be able to do the slide or the latch slipping. For RFID, using strong RFID and RFID shields. Window film, so we mentioned breaking glass. If you get security film, 3M's a manufacturer that sells these, you can make it a lot harder to break the window and get in. High security locks. UL has a standard and ANSI has a standard, and you'll see sometimes on the packaging this is UL certified. Some of these types of locks that are high security and certified are Medico, Schlage Primus, ASSA Abloy, and Multi-Locks. These are good for kind of the home installation. For safes, you have a UL certification that certifies these as well, and Group 1R and 2M are pretty solid choices. Type 1 is an electronic lock. X09s and X10s are electronic safe locks as well. They're really, really solid. Concrete and steel, the more barriers you can put between the valuables and the attacker, the better. An alarm system, motion sensor lights, trimming of bushes. There's a lot of resources out there online, from the lockpicking guide as well as YouTube videos, a lot of great YouTube videos. Bosnia and Bill, as well as Lockpicking Lawyer, are fun channels to watch. Give you a lot of techniques. If you look up Deviant Olam's talks, he has a lot of these techniques described as well. Lockpicking 101. There's a couple books. Some of these I like: Practical Lockpicking, Master Locksmithing, and some good reads. So conclusions, from doing all of this, what did I learn? Well, lockpicking is a lot of fun. It's a good way to get into the community. There's a lot of physical security mechanisms that can be easily bypassed. If you want to buy your own and start getting into this, I like Sparrow's lockpicks as well as Peterson and Southord. For running a lockpicking village, I recommend getting picks and having locks and kind of showing people how to do it, whether it's whatever medium you might choose. And then also special thanks to Grant, Dale, George, Abraxas, Ken, Dante, Tom, Stefan, Christian, Layla, Alex, Tom M., and Caden for helping out with some of the demos, as well as organizing some of these events and participating. That's it. Thank you very much. Is there any questions? Yeah.
What was the context under when you were teaching kids the lockpick? What was the event?
So the event was a science and technology event. There was a bunch of elementaries and high schools that kind of came together, and it was at a big fairground, and they would come and different businesses would have like a little table like this, and each one had a kind of different demo, and they could get some hands-on and play with different things. There was wood making and flying drones and all this kind of stuff to spark interest, and I had a lockpicking table there, and it's kind of funny. It was one of the more popular tables and one of the more rambunctious tables as well. The kids were actually taking handcuffs and putting them on teachers, and then they would go and run around with the locks, and they were actually able to get quite a few locks. So in my experience, what a first timer will typically get through, they'll get through the handcuffs, the shims, the clear pin tumblers, and they might get a couple other quick sets, as well as possibly the one spool pin. And then coming a couple times, more experience gets you higher into those higher security stuff. So any other questions? No? All right, well, thank you.